Welcome to this Global Highways Roundtable, where we discuss the new digital guidelines being brought in by the Association of Equipment Manufacturers. We'll talk about what they are and why they're important, as well as going over their challenges and, crucially, their benefits. Asking the questions is Global Highways editor Mike Wolf, and he's joined by Mike Gomes, Vice President, Sustainability and Global Corporate Social Responsibility at Topcon Positioning Systems, and John Summers, Vice President, Construction and Utility Sector at AEM. John began by giving us an overview of what the guidelines cover.
So AEM has released 3 guideline documents for the non-road industry. So levels of autonomy for non-road equipment, cybersecurity and machine data for non-road equipment, and then data layers for non-road equipment. We're continuing to say non-road equipment throughout this whole thing to make sure that we're differentiating ourselves from anything that's on road. I know sometimes, especially maybe in agriculture, some of our equipment does operate on the road. I mean, this is only for the non-road or off-road usage of the equipment that AEM's membership covers in the agriculture, forestry, construction, mining, and utility industries. So the autonomy one is defining the 6 different levels of automation or automated functions, 0 being nothing to 6 being, fully unsupervised autonomy with everything else in between. We can talk more about that and what each of those levels really encompasses. The data layer one, it's where the data is generated from and being transferred to, right? So whether that stays on board, gets off board, or then is the system of systems, multiple clouds talking to each other to create efficiency or insights down to one system. And then the cybersecurity one is probably the biggest overarching piece of this that touches the other 2, right? So cybersecurity really defines the role of who's responsible for securing what system in that system of systems. So it's whether stuff's on board, the inability to really tap into something physical versus authentication versus, open doors into any, cloud system, and defining whose responsibility it is to secure those systems and provide different access or even different access levels to different pieces of the data in those systems.
Why do you think these guidelines are needed?
We realize the need to help everyone level set and have a basic understanding of terminology and functionality as it comes to non-road equipment. It's really hard to have a conversation and help drive the industry forward if we're not all using common terms and referencing things in the same fashion. I mean, you think about that, even in other languages around the world, we may be speaking a different language, but a lot of the terms are just translated. So, referring to different levels of autonomy, for example, or whose responsibility it is for securing a specific data layer, being able to have that common globally is really important for the industry.
How does the AEM see these documents helping the construction industry in the future?
Yeah, so if we think, just the construction space, as organizations start to develop new technology or customers start to adopt it, it really is important for everybody to have expectations set, and understand whose role is whose. And if somebody says, there's automated functions on this machine, what does that mean? Not necessarily what functions are automated, but if they're saying different levels of autonomy, or we're semi-automated functions, but there still needs to be operator input, who's responsible for the safety and all of the different aspects around that. So it's really important for everyone to essentially be on the same page. This also helps, policymakers or project owners, understand the reason to adopt a technology like this. A lot of times people say autonomous equipment or autonomous vehicles, if we talk on road. A lot of times people don't really understand exactly what that means, and they may have some misconceptions of what will actually occur. A lot of times it's just, automating functions, getting data from sensors, understanding how that data is transmitted, and understanding the advantage of doing those things versus thinking we're jumping all the way to, the final step 10, which may not even exist yet.
And what were the challenges facing the team in generating these guidelines?
There's always a lot of challenges because some companies are doing things a little bit differently. So it's finding that commonality and just understanding and exposing that, right? So I think as anybody would work to develop a new language, terminology, anything like that, there's going to be different terms used, and just getting everybody in the same room, looking at each other face to face and saying, this is what we all agree on represents this appropriately. And then each company can go above and beyond that or add additional clarification to that.
I think I'd like to add a little bit there, John, I think in the fact that as we had one of our first joint meetings of both the ag technology and the construction technology groups together, it became pretty obvious that the idea of having elements of cross-pollination and some version of a common guidance document helped us all to communicate better as an industry. It helped us all bring together elements of that conversation so that then we could really start from what things are common rather than what things are different. And that really helped significantly in the conversation, so that then in many cases, both construction and agriculture often think of themselves in different camps. In this case, it's all equipment, and it's all equipment non-road. And so that really put us onto common ground, to the point where we could begin to address elements of these parts of the conversation and begin to help frame up what that means, so that then as an industry, we could begin to have a larger conversation.
Yeah, Mike, I think that's really important, right? I mean, separating the non-road industry from on-road, because we're all functioning in different spaces. But if you take a tractor on a farm and an excavator on a construction site, right, there's a lot more commonality than people think at first glance, right? I mean, you're operating not on a paved road. There's probably an engine in it. It's collecting data on sensors. There's an operator that is controlling some of the movement of the machine, but there are probably automated functions that are doing different things. So it's just taking all of those pieces and basically separating them, breaking them down, and not worrying about what the machine form is or what its end use really is, what it's doing, harvesting a crop, moving dirt. Don't worry about that. Just think about what it's doing at the core, right? And then, coming to a commonality, common terminology, common understanding, so we can all speak the same language, especially as things, progress and machine forms change. And
okay, so what new questions or new needs were uncovered as a result of this project from Topcon's perspective?
I think by putting together the guidance documents for both autonomy, as well as cybersecurity, as well as data access, that really enables us to have a conversation from being able to talk about how to get data on and off the machine, to elements of cybersecurity, to elements of how that frames into semi-autonomy and autonomous functions. And so really the three of these guidance documents helped us to bring together enough both industry experts together, as well as a common vocabulary, because each one of them begins to touch on the other one. And so you really can't have a conversation of one without being able to at least frame in parts of the conversation to all three. And so that's why we put out all three documents. And so that really helped us begin to have a more meaningful conversation, or I would say a more meaningful engagement. And so, John, I think you could probably speak to how the legislative team or how your advocacy team has been able to begin to start using these in conversations with regulators and or legislators.
yeah, I mean, and Mike, you kind of touched on it, right? I mean, they all overlap, right? So I mean, you can't automate functions and have autonomous equipment without data, and that data needs to be secure. So we need cybersecurity. So they're all touching each other, but they all kind of live in their different space. So to come back of, how AEM and our team in Washington's using these, and I guess around the country and around the globe, really, AEM's taken the approach of, education first. I mean, a lot of these people, that are out there that are policymakers, working to, advance infrastructure or farming systems, they're not living it every day like a lot of our members are or their customers are, right? So the education first approach is hey, here's, like I said a few times, like, here's this baseline, here is what is happening on the machine. I think there's, if we take a specific example of just data for a second, if you break that down, there's sensors on the machines that are talking to, you could let's call it like the brain of the machine, right? So that's still on board. And then that needs to get off the machine. Well, then you get into, wireless connectivity and the need for rural broadband. So once you understand the need to get this data off the machine, off the farm, off the construction job site, now we're talking to the people having the policy that build out the infrastructure to have connectivity in rural areas, right? So it depends on the angle of this and who really the audience is. But there's a lot of, aspects into this. I think the thing that everybody, regardless of, your beliefs, wants is modernized infrastructure and a more robust food source system, right? So, I mean, if we can do anything, I kind of hate the saying the do more with less, right? Like, don't take anything away from me. Like, give me the same amount, but let's just be way more efficient and do more, right? So if that is equipment diagnostics or making an inexperienced operator better through automated functions, data connectivity, so you kind of know, how the project's going, anything like that. I think once people get an understanding that by taking some of this technology and the data in can help improve the efficiency across, construction job sites, farms, like I think that just is a win for everyone.
I think it's also, John, I think another point is that it's a real win for small businesses, because increasingly if a business is going to begin to have, on a connected job site or on a connected farm, increasingly that's a system of systems world, right? It's a number of different manufacturers and a number of different subsystems working towards some version of a common plan. And so the ability for those mechanized pieces begin to offload that data layers, and those data layers are beginning to prove that people are doing more with less, that they are being the most efficient, that they are being good stewards of the resources, that they're burning less, moving less, creating less waste, all of those kinds of things. And so in doing that, those small businesses and contractors increasingly also have the need for cybersecurity. And so being able to go to the cloud, being able to understand how this smart connected equipment in these outdoor industries is now really begins to come under some of the same protections that you see in office systems coming under. And so really that helps create elements of business resiliency as well as defensibility, I would say, of the systems.
And that really gets into, playing into the customer's core competency, right? I mean, we have IT folks here on staff at AEM, right, that are thinking about our data and a little bit of security here. A lot of contractors and farmers don't have that, right? So, I mean, it's like getting this data off into a secure system on the cloud and letting someone who is a professional, deal with that security of that. And then the customer having that confidence that their data is kept secure, their systems aren't open, and probably almost just as important is that data is reliable, right? I mean, we talk about, security from a potential bad actor, but it's also just the resiliency, as you mentioned, Mike. I mean, if I'm relying on fleet management data to understand, how much fuel I burned or what equipment needs maintenance before, next week goes up, I mean, that data better be correct and it better be accessible. Otherwise, my operations could be totally thrown off, and, we takes two steps back, after we took one step forward in efficiency. So,
And from Topcon's perspective, in what ways do the new guidelines change how Topcon will need to work as a company that serves the construction industry?
I would say it's less about change and more about enabling. It really enables us to have a larger conversation, right? As Topcon, we manufacture and provide aftermarket systems, but in many cases, we work with a number of different original equipment manufacturers in addition. And in many cases, our technologies may be at some level either bolted on or eventually embedded into this equipment. And so that's where really these guidance documents, the reason that we that we participated in this process is because we sit in a bit of a unique space in the fact serving both the aftermarket and the OEMs, but also enabling to help foster a larger conversation amongst the industry. And in this system of systems world, it's really it's always challenging to have elements of conversations of communication. Okay, I'm doing this. How do you fit into the workflow? Okay, how do those two pieces come together? And so this enables us to do a better job of having those kind of conversations and elements of demonstrating value in these kind of accuracy levels, right? And being able to show how the sensors and technologies they're not just smart, but how you're able to now use those data layers and using those data layers in a way that creates value to your local business, right? What by proving that you have burned less or moved less or reduced waste or those kinds of things. And so in doing that, these guidance documents help us foster a larger conversation, both amongst the industry players as original equipment manufacturers, as well as with customers. Because, if you begin to look at this from the customer perspective, they look at a number of different branded solutions from different offerings from different companies, but they live in a world that where all of those things have to live together in the same pool, and so they face those challenges, and so we participated in this effort as a means to help try and bridge the gap, right? Try and show that we're really interested in not just growing our business, but in growing the industry as a whole and helping to foster and create elements of that resiliency as well as a larger conversation, because we see that the world is continuing down this world of mechanization to automation, automation to digitization. And so as we're continuing to get to that digitization world, we have to be able to use the data layers, interact with the data layers, and make them useful in a workflow. And so that means collaboration both upstream and downstream amongst industry partners, whether that's aggregates providers, whether that's fertilizers, whether that's cement, and input providers, or it's elements of outputs. And how is it that we prove that this was built to the right specification, that it was done exactly as we said, right? Those kinds of things. And so increasingly digital data layers enable to create value around those parts of the conversation.
Mike, I think that's a really interesting perspective, right? Because you mentioned Topcon working with multiple OEMs and really trying to provide those products and services that help the end customer, right? I mean, that's where AEM sits. I mean, I'll say we work with all the OEMs, right? Maybe not every single company is a member of us, but we're trying to help the industry. So coming up with a common language, common terminology, anything that all of our members, the equipment OEMs, technology providers can get behind so their customer becomes more efficient is the total name of the game, right? I don't know any construction contractor that doesn't have a mixed fleet. I don't think any fleet has the same brand on it. I mean, then you go as far as you have earth moving equipment, paving equipment, then you rent some equipment. I mean, it's a big mix now, right? So setting those expectations so you can anticipate, everything to essentially function in the same way, or if it says it, provides this type of data, or this function is automated, like that basically would mean the same across anything, your operators are working on any given construction project.
Really fostering that interoperability so that then we can be more efficient. We can be better in our business process and most efficient with the resources. Absolutely. I agree with you on that, John, 100%.
How long do you think it'll take for these new guidelines to be adopted, and what might prevent their adoption in industry?
I'll take a stab at that one first, right? I think adoption of the guidelines is an interesting question because I think these are living documents, right? So I truly believe that over time, as equipment OEMs might say, hey, we were using a slightly different term, this is the industry de facto term right now or standard, like we can switch to this. I think it's also important for the folks that would be using these terms in the field, like the end users, project owners, people working in the specs, to start using these as well, because that's what really drives it back up the value chain. So I think when, it's a little bit different where it maybe not different in this industry, because I feel like a lot are probably like this, but it's kind of an up and down flow, right? I mean, there was never really a language or a term that was like pushed onto everybody. I mean, there needs to be that mutual understanding and, kind of up and down movement of that for people to adopt. I don't know that there's an end goal of like, let's get these adopted, globally by a certain date, right? I think it's just our perspective of this is really just to have something to reference, start the conversation. If we learn that, things change over time, like if we look at the levels of autonomy one, there's currently 6 levels in there. Maybe at some point there'd be a 7th level, or 2 of those levels kind of merge because one goes away. I think, having these as a flowing conversation is really important. So, I mean, these are out there now. They've been out there for a few months. AEM had a event in Washington, D.C. at the National Mall, and I know a lot of these were referenced in those conversations, with the policymakers, with the general public, and all the above. So, Mike, I don't know your perspective on that, but I mean, I think it's, kind of an ever-evolving piece of the industry.
It absolutely is. And so the best way that we've always referred to this is these enable us as an industry to all sing from the same music, right? The idea is an industry is a choir of voices, and these guidance documents basically help to coordinate the conversation, right? Now, the timing of that conversation is pretty good. This year, 2025, we've had a Bauma. Earlier in the year, we've got an Agritechnica coming up in the fall, and then on the heels of next spring with a ConExpo, and so it's increasingly being able to foster this conversation amongst industry members. It's becoming more and more important, and the ability to begin to have this conversation across borders and across the different geographies in a way that enables us to have a coordinated communication, so that then we can really begin to understand elements of that interoperability and elements of how so much of this as an industry is really working hand in glove as we continue to progress forward.
Mike, I like that you referenced those events, right? So I think from AEM's perspective, we can work with our members, to get their buy-in to this. And then you mentioned ConExpo, ConAg next spring. We have our Show Utility Expo coming up this fall. It's getting that message out and just watching it grow word of mouth across that way, right? I mean, if we just told our members or just your audience, right? I mean, that only goes so far. So I think, for our members to push it out to their customers, maybe we'll share this with dealers and all the above, and then we'll just watch that, continue to multiply.
I suppose the dark side of interoperability would be from potential cyber hacking. I'm just curious what kind of a potential threat could come from commercial hacking of this sort. How can the industry avoid this becoming a problem?
Well, that's part of why these guidance documents were developed, so that then we can begin to make sure that the appropriate levels of security, that the appropriate levels of situational awareness, that the appropriate levels of various responsibility are being addressed, and that we can do so in a way that enables us to communicate not just within our industry, but also to people outside of our industry. 2 years ago, the agricultural industry got approached because in the US, the FBI was beginning to help to look at where were the vulnerabilities within the supply chain of our industry. And so AEM assembled a panel so that then we could begin to address that. And so it's elements out of these kind of conversations, these kinds of guidance documents really help us frame up really how, in many cases, we are covering the bases. In many cases, we are making sure that there is a strong amount of embedded security, as well as resiliency, as well as some level of redundancy of systems. And increasingly, with the connectivity, you begin to enable things like multi-factor authentication. You begin to we're beginning to these kind of documents help explain how our outdoor industries of agriculture and construction are beginning to follow many of the same security protocols and best practices that you see in in-office security. It's just beginning to get to the outdoor industries. And so it's elements of these guidance documents help us communicate, and they also help us understand who's taking care of this in system of systems world, right? Because we have onboard technologies and data, we have offboard technologies of data, and then we have the road in between. And so whether that's between the tractor and the implement, whether that's between the individual implement doing the work and some version of a common system of record, and a cloud-based repository, increasingly there are a number of pieces in that puzzle. And so these guidance documents really help to lay up and address so that then an end user can begin to ask some very basic questions of, okay, if this part is handled here, who's handling this part? Or if I'm using this cloud-based system, how am I making sure that this and this and this concerns are being addressed, right? It's elements of these documents have been put out in the interest of transparency as an industry to help foster a conversation, so that then to help also educate the end users to begin to understand how to ask questions amongst industry providers, so that then we can accurately explain how we're really working to create value and serve an industry.
I think the worst thing, that can happen, and this probably goes across a lot of different aspects, is people not understanding whose role is what, right? So if I think, hey, I thought you were going to handle that, whatever that is, right? I might be right, but if that person didn't know that that was their job, then nobody's doing it. Or I'm making the assumption that somebody else is handling it, which probably is worse, and then nobody has it on their radar, right? So I think just basically having that understanding of whose role is what, and, like Mike referenced there with, the different data layers and who's responsible for what level of security, I think that's the most important. At least then people know what they can expect. I keep coming back to the setting expectations piece of this, right? So, they know what to expect. They think, you mentioned two-factor authentication, Mike. I mean, if that's on the end user, to add that extra level of security to any system they're logging into, they know that. But then they assume that everything after that, is handled by whoever it's documented that it's responsible for. So I think everybody just knowing, their role and making sure that that's happening instead of everyone pointing fingers, right? I think that's probably one of the most important pieces.
Right. Probably one of the most significant things is that we work to define both the role of the operator and then the role of the machine, and really to help illustrate how over the successive layers, how you see elements of responsibility migrate from one to another, right? So the idea that when you're at manual operation, the operator is 100% responsible, but when you're at unsupervised operation, the machine is effectively has the vast majority of the responsibility. And so the guidance documents do a really nice job of helping to explain elements of that transition in a way that can foster a conversation that's more common to a number of different people. And so if you're a startup or somebody new to our industry and you may not be as familiar with our industry, you can begin to look at these guidance documents and begin to kind of understand where you fit or how you might fit in with other players within the industry, if that's fair, John.
Yeah, and Mike, I think that's a good point, right? I mean, earlier I referenced, some of the policymakers or just general public project owners that aren't as familiar with our equipment in the industry or anything like that. So one of the neat things we did in there is we added consumer examples. So the really easy one is if you're cleaning a floor, right, like the level 0 of autonomy is a broom and a dustpan because you're doing all the work. You get into level 1 and you're a vacuum, because the brush is spinning itself, but you're still moving it around and fully responsible for where that vacuum goes. Then as you keep going up a few more layers, then you get into the robot vacuums who, you could say those are supervised autonomy because they might get stuck and run into the same wall 10 times in a row, right? You got to help them out. But, it's pretty much doing all the work for you and you're not touching it. So I think bringing, some of these non-road examples, equipment examples back to the consumer also helps everybody, set that baseline, get that better understanding, because I think everybody's vacuumed in their life, right? So, not everybody's run an excavator. And so I think it's really important to, to kind of, bring this into, we're talking about common terminology here, and now we're using different terms that people are more familiar with, right? But I mean, I think relating it, to the general public or somebody to get a better understanding is important.
I think it's also important that we had in that autonomy example, there's both agriculture and construction examples so that then people can really see how in many cases those two industries are more aligned and more alike than most people think. And so I thought it did a nice job of really helping to illustrate how the industry, whereas there are two segments, construction and agriculture, and they are very different, but in many cases there is a significant amount of common infrastructure, a number of common elements, and quite a bit of common understanding and engineering and experience beginning to work towards the behalf of a stronger industry.
I just like to say thanks for the opportunity to be on this and talk with everyone here today. I mean, I think it's a great opportunity for AEM to more widely broadcast the work that our members have done on behalf of the industry. I mean, we were essentially, I guess, driving this, but we'll give credit to all of our members in the room that are the industry experts, that all came together and came to agreement on this. I know I've said this before, but I think, well, one of the an industry association's job, is we have multiple jobs, but one of the things is developing documents like this, primarily for the sole reason of driving the industry forward, creating efficiencies, and ultimately driving adoption of technology. I strongly feel that, people are, whether it's contractors, are more reluctant to adopt technology if they don't have a clear understanding and expectation set. So I think understanding and helping everyone set the same expectations, they know kind of what they're getting into and whose role is what and what they can experience when they, implement that technology into their fleet. So from our perspective, I mean, I think the adoption of technology and driving the industry forward and building, more resilient infrastructure around the world is one of the industry's primary goals.
At Topcon, we're always looking to help foster a more progressive industry, but also elements of not just building a bigger industry, but also elements of creating value for our customers. And we see these guidance documents as really a significant step towards that because they help foster a conversation about technology and about things that aren't necessarily all that easy to speak to in a way that makes it much more relatable and helps end users begin to understand how to ask the questions of service providers and particularly different types of service providers. Cloud-based services, hardware on the machine, data layers in between the machine, and so they frame out and begin to provide enough of an understanding to help people understand how we're creating value, as well as how many of their concerns are being addressed amongst those various systems. But it is a bit of a complex conversation because we do live in a system of systems world.
Thank you to both our guests today, John Summers and Mike Gomes, and to Mike Wolf from Global Highways as the host. An interesting discussion on the new guidelines and what they mean to everyone involved. It's clear there are efficiencies to be gained here from adopting this new set of standards right across autonomy, data layers, and cybersecurity. Thank you again, and I hope you enjoyed the discussion.